When I refused to pay my sister-in-law's crushing $80,000 debt, my mother-in-law erupted in rage and secretly stripped my husband and me of our entire inheritance overnight. But just when they thought they had destroyed us, a shocking truth was exposed. My name is Nia. I am 32 years old, an executive director at a private equity firm, and somehow still healing from wounds my husband's family inflicted. As a successful financial executive, I tried to establish strict boundaries, but I maintained obligatory contact for the sake of my husband, Julian. Last Sunday, they invited us to their traditional family dinner. Between the sweet tea and the cornbread, my mother-in-law leaned forward smirking. She told me I was lucky to even be sitting at her table. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth and tried to use you as their personal bank account. Growing up in Atlanta meant understanding the deep importance of family image and generational wealth. In the circles we moved in, maintaining appearances was just as important as the money in the bank. But inside my husband Julian's childhood home, emotional manipulation permeated every single corner. The sprawling brick house, entirely paid off by his late father, was a fortress of expectations that I could never quite meet. The dining room was always loud, the air thick with the smell of baked macaroni and cheese, candied yams, collard greens, and unspoken resentment. I always dreaded these Sunday dinners. Brenda, my mother-in-law, ruled the table like a monarch holding court. She used the family logistics company, built from the ground up through her late husband's blood, sweat, and tears, as a weapon to control her children. She constantly reminded everyone that she held the keys to the kingdom and could lock anyone out at a moment's notice. Sitting directly across from me was Chloe. Chloe is 30 years old and Julian's younger sister. She was the undeniable golden child of the family. Chloe called herself an influencer and an entrepreneur. She had opened a luxury fashion boutique 2 years ago, fully funded by a massive loan from Brenda. But instead of running a legitimate business, Chloe used the boutique as a front to fund a lifestyle she could not actually afford. She was always dressed head to toe in designer labels, her hair and makeup flawlessly done by professionals, projecting an image of extreme wealth on social media. I knew the truth. I worked in private equity. I analyzed financial statements and market trends for a living. I could smell a bad investment from a mile away, and Chloe was a walking, breathing financial disaster waiting to happen. The dinner started with the usual passive-aggressive remarks. Brenda complimented Chloe's new diamond earrings, then turned to me and asked why I always wore such boring masculine suits to work. She wondered aloud if I was trying to intimidate my husband. I simply sipped my ice water and smiled. I refused to give her the reaction she desperately wanted. Julian squeezed my knee under the table, a silent thank you for keeping the peace. But the fragile peace was not meant to last. Halfway through the meal, the atmosphere drastically shifted. Brenda cleared her throat loudly, commanding the attention of the entire room. She reached into her expensive designer handbag, sitting on the empty chair next to her. She pulled out a thick, crumpled piece of paper with a bright red header. Without a single word of warning, Brenda reached across the large mahogany table and slammed the paper directly onto my plate, right on top of my food. The loud smack echoed in the dining room. The room went completely silent. Julian dropped his fork, the metal clinking loudly against his plate. I looked down at the paper. It was a final collections notice from a high-risk commercial lender. The amount due was absolutely staggering, $80,000. I calmly picked up the paper, wiped a smear of gravy off the corner with my linen napkin, and looked directly at Brenda. I kept my voice perfectly level and asked her what exactly this was supposed to be. Brenda crossed her arms and leaned back in her heavily upholstered chair. She looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. She stated it was a business loan for Chloe's boutique. She claimed Chloe had run into some minor cash flow issues due to a bad vendor, and the predatory lenders were threatening to seize the store assets and liquidate her inventory. Then Brenda dropped the absolute bomb. She looked me dead in the eye and demanded that I pay it. She said I worked in private equity, making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. She said 80 grand was just pocket change to someone like me. She told me to do it for the family. She said the debt collectors were threatening to post the default notices on social media, which would completely ruin the family reputation at our church and in our community. I stared at her, completely stunned by the sheer audacity of her demand. I looked over at Chloe. Chloe was not looking down in shame or embarrassment. Instead, she was swirling the ice in her glass, looking incredibly smug, as if my paying her massive debt was a foregone conclusion. She actually believed she was entitled to the money I worked grueling 80-hour weeks to earn. She thought my bank account was her personal safety net. I placed the paper back on the table. I smoothed out the wrinkled edges with my hands. I kept my voice perfectly level and professional, using the exact same tone I use in hostile corporate boardroom negotiations. I looked directly at Brenda and said, "Absolutely not. I will not pay a single dime of this debt." Brenda gasped loudly, clutching the pearls around her neck in mock horror. She demanded to know how I could be so selfish and cold-hearted. She loudly declared that family always helps family in times of need. I did not raise my voice, but my words cut through the heavy air of the dining room like shattered glass. I turned my sharp attention to Chloe. I told Chloe she did not use that loan money for her boutique inventory store rent or employee payroll. I told everyone at the table exactly what I knew. I said I saw her Instagram stories all throughout last month. I saw the first-class flight tickets to Dubai. I saw the videos of the 5-star luxury resort suites overlooking the ocean. I saw the brand new beige Hermes Birkin bag sitting prominently on the table in all of her posts. I looked back at Brenda and told her that $80,000 did not go into a struggling business. It went into funding a fake superficial lifestyle. I told them both that I was not going to subsidize Chloe's delusions of grandeur. Chloe turned bright red, her smug expression vanishing instantly. She slammed both of her hands flat on the table and screamed that I was nothing but a jealous hater. She said I was just a boring corporate drone who did not understand the massive financial investment required to build a personal brand and network with high-net-worth clients. She looked at her mother and immediately started crying on command, huge crocodile tears rolling down her perfectly contoured face. That was the moment when Julian finally had enough. He stood up abruptly from his chair. Julian is a high school principal, a man deeply used to maintaining order and commanding respect, and his deep voice boomed through the dining room. He pointed a firm finger at his sister and told her to stop the fake crying right now. He then looked at his mother and firmly stated that she could not ambush his wife like this in their home. He told Brenda that Naya's money was her own hard-earned money, and they were absolutely not going to drain their personal savings to pay off Chloe's reckless credit card bills. Julian stated clearly that it was past time for Chloe to grow up and take responsibility for her own actions. The silence that followed Julian's powerful words was deafening. Nobody ever stood up to Brenda. Nobody ever challenged the matriarch's authority. Brenda's face contorted in pure, unadulterated rage. Her eyes narrowed into tiny, dangerous slits. The carefully crafted mask of the loving church-going mother completely slipped away, revealing the ruthless, controlling manipulator underneath. Brenda stood up slowly, leaning her weight on the table. She pointed a shaking finger directly at Julian. Her voice was deadly quiet, but it carried a vicious threat that chilled the room. She told Julian that he was choosing an outsider over his own flesh and blood. She said if he let his wife disrespect his sister and his mother in their own home, there would be severe, immediate consequences. Julian stood his ground, crossing his arms. He calmly told his mother that setting a basic financial boundary was not disrespect, it was reality. Brenda slammed her fist hard on the table, rattling the expensive crystal water glasses. She decided to drop her ultimate trump card. She told Julian that if he did not force me to write that check to the lenders by tomorrow morning, she would personally call the family lawyer at dawn. She reminded him in a vicious tone that she was the sole executor of his late father's estate. She looked him right in the eyes and said she would write him out of the $1 million trust fund entirely. She said she would strip him of his 50% stake in the family logistics company, the company his father intended for him to run, and she would give every single penny, every single physical asset, and every single share of stock directly to Chloe. She smiled a wicked, triumphant smile, relishing the power trip. She told Julian he would be left with absolutely nothing from his father's legacy. She truly thought this massive threat would break us. She thought the overwhelming fear of losing generational wealth would make me pull out my checkbook and submit to her financial control. She thought she held all the power in the room. Julian looked like he had been physically struck in the chest. The profound betrayal from his own mother weaponizing his father's legacy just to protect his spoiled, irresponsible sister was a devastating blow. He looked over at me, his eyes full of conflict, shock, and deep pain. I did not break character. I did not cry. I did not beg for forgiveness or try to negotiate a payment plan. I knew exactly how to handle arrogant bullies who thought money was their only leverage in life. I pushed my chair back slowly and stood up to my full height. I smoothly picked up my purse from the floor and carefully adjusted my coat. I looked down at Brenda and Chloe, my expression completely blank and unbothered. I looked at Julian and softly told him it was time to go home. I did not say another word to Brenda. I did not even look at the red collection notice still sitting on the table. As I walked out of the formal dining room, leaving my untouched food behind, I pulled out my cell phone. I opened my encrypted messaging app and typed a single urgent text message to my executive assistant at Oak Capital. I typed, "Run a full shadow credit sweep on Chloe's boutique by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I want to know every commercial debt, every property lien, and every hidden financial liability she currently has." I hit send. As the heavy wooden front door of the estate closed behind us, completely cutting off the loud sounds of Brenda's furious yelling, I felt a cold, sharp sense of clarity wash over me. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought taking away Julian's inheritance was the ultimate punishment to put me in my place. But they had absolutely no idea who they were truly dealing with. They had no idea that I already owned the chessboard. The drive back to our house was suffocatingly quiet. Julian gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned stark white under the streetlights. He was a man who had spent his entire life trying to balance the scales between the family he was born into and the family he had chosen to build with me. Tonight, that scale had completely shattered. When we finally walked through our front door, Julian collapsed onto the living room sofa, burying his face in his hands. He kept repeating that his mother would never actually go through with it, that it was just a high-pressure negotiation tactic to force my hand. I poured him a glass of water, sat beside him, and told him to prepare for the worst. I work in the world of high-stakes finance and cutthroat corporate takeovers. I recognize a hostile move when I see one. Brenda was not bluffing. She was deeply offended that her absolute authority had been challenged, and people like her would gladly burn down their own house just to prove they control the matches. At exactly 7 o'clock the next morning, my prediction became our harsh reality. Julian's phone rang. It was Brenda. Her voice was ice-cold, completely stripped of any maternal warmth. She demanded that we come back to the estate immediately. She said the family attorney was already sitting in the parlor and there were documents requiring Julian's signature. Julian hung up the phone, looking completely numb. I did not say a word. I simply walked into my closet, selected my sharpest charcoal gray tailored suit, and strapped on my watch. I was dressing for a corporate execution. When we pulled into the long, sweeping driveway of the estate, I immediately recognized the black Mercedes sedan parked near the entrance. It belonged to Marcus Vance, the longtime legal counsel for the family logistics company. As we walked through the heavy front doors and stepped into the formal parlor, the atmosphere was incredibly tense. Marcus was sitting on the antique leather sofa, his briefcase open on the coffee table, arranging several thick stacks of legal documents. Brenda sat in the high-backed armchair opposite him wearing a dark silk blouse, looking like a judge ready to pass down a heavy sentence. Chloe was standing near the fireplace, sipping a latte, wearing designer sunglasses indoors to hide her puffy eyes from her fake crying the night before. Julian stepped forward, asking Marcus what was going on. Marcus looked down, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, adjusting his glasses before speaking. He cleared his throat and explained that Brenda, acting in her legal capacity as the sole executor and primary trustee of the late father's estate, was exercising a deeply buried clause in the trust agreement. This specific clause allowed her to reallocate the disbursement of the business assets if she deemed one of the beneficiaries to be acting against the best interests of the family corporation. It was a subjective, legally murky loophole, but challenging. It would require years of expensive litigation. Brenda did not wait for Marcus to finish the legal jargon. She stood up, snatched the top document from the stack and shoved it toward Julian. She told him this was his final chance. She said if I transferred the $80,000 to Chloe's creditors right then and there, she would tell Marcus to pack up his briefcase and go home. She said she was being more than generous by offering us a way out. Julian did not even look at the document. He looked directly into his mother's eyes. He asked her if she was really willing to destroy her relationship with her only son over a fashion boutique that had never turned a single dollar of profit. He asked her if this was how she was going to honor his father's legacy by weaponizing the logistics company he built with his bare hands. Brenda slammed her hand on the table. She told Julian that his father built that company to protect the family, and right now I was the biggest threat to this family. She declared that since Julian refused to control his wife, he was no longer fit to manage the family assets. Marcus sighed heavily and handed Julian a high-quality pen. He pointed to the bottom of the page. He stated that by signing the document, Julian was formally acknowledging the reallocation of his 50% stake in the logistics enterprise. The entire portfolio, including the fleet of commercial trucks, the massive storage warehouse on the south side of Atlanta, and the active vendor contracts, would be transferred fully and exclusively to Chloe. She would become the sole owner of a company valued at roughly $4.5 million. Julian stared at the pen for a long time. I could see the profound grief washing over him. This was not just about the money. This company was the last tangible connection he had to his father. He remembered riding in the passenger seat of those delivery trucks when he was 8 years old. He remembered sweeping the warehouse floors to earn his allowance. Now, his mother was ripping that legacy away from him and handing it to a woman who could not even balance a basic checkbook. Julian took a deep breath, took the pen from Marcus, and signed his name with quick, forceful strokes. He pushed the paper back across the table. He told his mother that she could keep the company, and he hoped she and Chloe would be very happy together. The moment the ink was dry, Chloe's entire demeanor changed. The anxious, dependent little sister vanished, replaced by an incredibly arrogant and smug woman who suddenly believed she was a corporate titan. She took her designer sunglasses off and walked slowly over to Julian. She looked him up and down with an expression of pure pity and disgust. "You chose your selfish wife over your blood," Chloe said, a wicked smile spreading across her perfectly painted lips. "Now I own the empire. You are going to have to wake up every single morning and go to your boring little school job knowing you threw away millions of dollars just because you let this woman control you. You are weak, Julian." Julian's shoulders slumped. The sheer cruelty of his own sister gloating over his disinheritance broke something deep inside him. He looked utterly devastated, a man completely hollowed out by the betrayal of the two women who were supposed to love him unconditionally. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words would not come. I stepped directly in front of Julian, physically cutting off Chloe's line of sight to my husband. I was not going to let them see him bleed. I looked Chloe dead in the eye, my face a mask of absolute stone. I told Chloe she did not own an empire. I told her she owned a logistics company in a highly volatile supply chain market, and she had absolutely no idea how to run it. I reminded her that owning assets also meant owning liabilities. I looked over at Brenda, who was watching me with a satisfied smirk, entirely convinced she had won the war. I told them both that they had just made the biggest financial mistake of their lives. I grabbed Julian's hand, gripping it tightly to transfer my strength to him. I told him to hold his head up high because we were walking out of this house with our dignity intact, which was something they could never afford to buy. We turned our backs on them and walked out the door. We did not look back. As soon as Julian and I got back into our car, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was an encrypted email from my executive assistant at Oak Capital. The subject line simply read, "Background financial sweep completed." I opened the attached PDF file while Julian started the engine. The data was even worse than I had anticipated. Chloe was not just $80,000 in debt. Her credit was completely radioactive. She had maxed out 5 different high-interest credit cards. She had taken out several predatory payday loans to cover her personal expenses. But the most crucial piece of information was at the very bottom of the report. The collections agency hunting her for the $80,000 had officially issued a 10-day final notice. If she did not secure that capital within a week, they were going to freeze all of her personal bank accounts. Chloe was desperate. She now held the paper title to a $4.5 million commercial enterprise, but she had absolutely zero liquid cash to pay her immediate debts. I knew exactly what she was going to do next. People like Chloe do not restructure businesses or cut expenses. They treat hard assets like giant ATM machines. By Wednesday morning, my prediction materialized with absolute perfection. Chloe, drunk on her newfound power and completely blind to the realities of commercial finance, decided she needed a massive injection of cash. She wanted enough money to pay off her boutique debt, upgrade her luxury apartment, and throw a massive rebranding party to show off her new status as a logistics CEO. Armed with the freshly signed legal documents proving her 100% ownership of the family empire, Chloe confidently strutted into the sleek glass-enclosed lobby of one of the most exclusive commercial lending firms in downtown Atlanta. She walked up to the reception desk wearing a bright pink Chanel suit, carrying a thick binder of her new company assets. She demanded an expedited commercial mortgage offering the family warehouse and the entire fleet of trucks as collateral for a high-interest cash loan. Chloe sat down in the luxurious waiting area, sipping a complimentary sparkling water, completely unaware of the trap she was willingly walking into. She watched as her file was carried back into the executive suites. What Chloe did not know, and what Brenda could have never possibly anticipated, was the true reach of my influence in this city. The lending firm she chose was a subsidiary operation. It was a boutique commercial credit branch, wholly owned and heavily funded by Oak Capital Management, my firm. Behind the thick frosted glass of the senior underwriting office, the loan officer reviewing Chloe's desperate application was a man named David. David is a brilliant, ruthless financial analyst. And more importantly, David is my direct subordinate. He answers to only one executive director in the entire building: me. As David flipped through Chloe's falsified income projections and the newly transferred ownership deeds, he picked up his desk phone and dialed my private direct extension. The pieces were finally set on the board, and the game was officially mine to win. I answered the phone on the first ring. David did not waste time with pleasantries. He informed me that my sister-in-law was sitting in his pristine lobby trying to leverage $4.5 million in commercial assets for a high-interest short-term cash advance. I leaned back in my leather chair and looked out the floor-to-ceiling window of my corner office. I asked David if her paperwork was legally binding. He confirmed she possessed the fully executed transfer deeds, completely signed over by Julian and Brenda. I smiled. I instructed David to approve the loan. I told him to give her the maximum amount of cash she requested, but to lock in the strictest default clauses legally permissible. I wanted the grace period to be razor thin, with immediate asset seizure protocols triggered upon a single missed payment. David understood exactly what I was doing. He is a shark, and he smelled the blood in the water. He processed the paperwork with alarming speed, handed Chloe a massive cashier's check, and effectively handed me the leash to her entire financial future. Armed with hundreds of thousands of dollars in newly acquired high-interest debt, Chloe did exactly what I predicted she would do. She did not invest a single penny into stabilizing the logistics company. She did not pay the loyal truck drivers their delayed overtime. She did not update the aging, breaking down fleet of delivery vehicles. Instead, she went on an absolute tear. Within 48 hours, my social media feeds were flooded with the chaotic evidence of her manic spending spree. She purchased a brand new matte black Mercedes G-Wagon, paying a ridiculous premium just to drive it off the dealership lot that same afternoon. She posted high-definition videos of herself popping expensive bottles of champagne in the VIP sections of exclusive downtown nightclubs. She bought an entirely new wardrobe of designer clothes, flashing the recognizable logos of luxury brands in every single photograph. She was desperately trying to project the image of a young self-made CEO to her fake internet friends. But the money was not enough to satisfy her ego. Chloe needed to actively destroy my reputation to justify her hostile takeover of the family empire. Sunday morning arrived, and she launched a vicious, highly calculated smear campaign at the massive megachurch our family had attended for 2 generations. The church was a pillar of the wealthy Black community in Atlanta, a place where social standing was just as important as spiritual devotion. Chloe and Brenda stood in the grand main foyer of the sanctuary wearing their finest, most elaborate Sunday hats. They deliberately positioned themselves to intercept every single elder deacon and influential family friend who walked through the heavy wooden doors. Chloe turned on the waterworks, performing a theatrical display of fake grief. She told everyone a fabricated, horrific story about how I was a cold, calculating corporate monster who had infiltrated their family. She claimed I was financially abusing Julian, completely controlling his bank accounts and ruthlessly isolating him from his own blood relatives. Brenda backed up every single lie with dramatic flair. She grabbed the hands of the older women, tears streaming down her face, telling the congregation that Julian was trapped under my toxic spell. She painted herself as the heartbroken matriarch who was forced to step in and save the logistics company before I could forcefully liquidate it and steal their generational wealth. In the tight-knit community of a megachurch, gossip travels faster than the speed of light. By Monday morning, my personal cell phone was absolutely blowing up. The harassment was relentless and incredibly invasive. I received long lecturing paragraphs of text messages from church aunties quoting scripture at me. They told me that a wise woman builds her house, but a foolish one tears it down with her own hands. I received angry, aggressive voicemails from family friends who had known Julian since he was in diapers, demanding to know why I was keeping a good son away from his grieving mother. My own inbox at work was spammed with anonymous messages calling me a gold digger and a manipulator. They accused me of tearing a beautiful Christian family apart. Julian was furious. When he heard the voicemails left on my phone, his face turned dark with pure rage. He wanted to march straight down to the church office and publicly confront his mother and sister in front of the pastor. He wanted to log onto social media and expose the absolute truth about the $80,000 debt, the disinheritance, and Chloe's reckless behavior. He wanted to scream his innocence to the world and defend his wife. I physically stopped him. I placed my hands on his shoulders and looked him directly in the eyes. I told him that arguing with fools only proves there are 2 fools in the room. I explained that in the world of high-stakes warfare, the loudest person in the room is almost always the weakest. I told Julian that I absolutely refused to waste my breath defending my character to people who were deeply committed to misunderstanding me. Their opinions did not pay our mortgage, and their gossip did not impact my stock portfolio. Instead of reacting emotionally, I responded methodically. I opened a new highly encrypted folder on my secure cloud drive. I simply named the folder Receipts. I am an auditor by nature, and I know that the best defense against a liar is a meticulously documented paper trail. I took high-resolution screenshots of every single harassing text message, making sure the phone numbers and timestamps were clearly visible. I downloaded and saved every single angry voicemail into a secure audio file. But more importantly, I started compiling the hard, undeniable evidence of Chloe's financial crimes and hypocrisies. I downloaded the time-stamped social media videos of her clubbing and VIP sections on the exact same days she tearfully told the church congregation she was supposedly working 80-hour weeks to save the struggling family business. I pulled the public property records from the county courthouse, which clearly showed the new predatory commercial liens she had just attached to the company warehouse. I gathered bank statements, legal transfer documents, and photographic evidence. Every time Brenda or Chloe told a public lie, I quietly filed away the corresponding truth. I was building an ironclad legal and social prosecution, and they were arrogant enough to hand me the murder weapon on a silver platter. I did not need to scream my truth because when the time came, the documents would speak for themselves. While Chloe was busy securing her status as a local socialite and Brenda was busy playing the ultimate victim at choir practice, the actual foundation of their newly acquired empire was rapidly rotting away. Running a massive logistics company requires intense dedication. complex supply chain management, and constant communication with demanding corporate clients. It is not a job you can do while nursing a hangover from a Tuesday night club appearance or shopping for luxury handbags. On Thursday afternoon, I was sitting in a board meeting when I felt my smartwatch vibrate with a priority notification. It was a text message from a very close, highly confidential contact within my corporate network. This contact was a senior procurement manager at one of the largest national retail chains in the country. More importantly, this retail chain was the logistics company's largest and most lucrative vendor. Their massive shipping contract was the only financial lifeline keeping Brenda's old company afloat. I stepped out of the boardroom and called my contact back immediately. The information he gave me was absolutely catastrophic for Chloe. He told me that over the past 2 weeks, Chloe had completely ignored their daily dispatch communications. She had failed to authorize the overtime pay for the truck drivers, resulting in a massive labor strike that she tried to arrogantly cover up. Because of her sheer negligence and incompetence, 36 cargo trucks carrying highly perishable expensive merchandise had been left sitting in the scorching Georgia sun for 4 days. The inventory was completely ruined. My contact lowered his voice and delivered the final blow. He told me that his retail company was officially done. They were not just pausing the contract. They had legally terminated the entire vendor agreement due to gross mismanagement and breach of contract. They were pulling all of their business away from Chloe's logistics company, effective immediately. Furthermore, they were preparing to file a massive lawsuit against Chloe for the cost of the destroyed inventory. I ended the call and walked slowly back to my corner office. I looked down at the bustling city streets of Atlanta below me. The massive commercial loan that Chloe had just taken from my firm required monthly payments based on the projected revenue from that exact retail contract. Without that vendor, the logistics company had zero incoming cash flow. They were essentially a dead man walking. Chloe had just spent hundreds of thousands of dollars she no longer had a way to repay, and the razor-thin grace period on her loan was ticking down like a time bomb. While I was silently watching the impending collapse of their financial house of cards, Brenda was growing increasingly furious at my absolute refusal to engage with her. Narcissists feed on reaction. They desperately need you to defend yourself, to argue, to show them that their attacks are causing you pain. My complete silence was starving her of the control she craved. The smear campaign at our megachurch had certainly caused a temporary social headache, but it had not produced the results Brenda truly wanted. I had not called her begging for a truce. Julian had not left me. We had not written a check for $80,000. Frustrated by her inability to break me, Brenda decided to change her tactics. She realized that she could not touch my career in private equity. My corporate world was completely insulated from her church gossip. So she aimed her venom at the most vulnerable and important thing left in our lives. She decided to actively destroy Julian's career. Julian is an exceptional educator. He is the principal of one of the most highly rated public high schools in the Atlanta metropolitan district. He spent his entire adult life building his professional reputation. He is fiercely dedicated to his students, respected by his faculty, and heavily relied upon by the community. In the world of public education, your moral character and public perception are just as critical as your administrative skills. A single credible accusation of misconduct can trigger immediate suspension, public scandal, and the permanent loss of an educational license. Brenda knew this perfectly well. She knew exactly how much Julian's career meant to him, and she decided to use it as her ultimate weapon of extortion. It was a Tuesday morning, a particularly important day for Julian's school. The regional superintendent of the school district was on campus for a scheduled annual performance review. The administrative office was buzzing with activity, trying to ensure everything looked perfect for the district executives. It was the absolute worst possible time for a personal disruption, which meant it was the perfect time for Brenda's grand performance. Just before the morning bell rang, Brenda walked through the double-glass doors of the main school office. She was not dressed in her usual sharp, intimidating attire. Instead, she had deliberately dressed down, wearing an oversized, slightly wrinkled cardigan and flat shoes, clutching a worn tissue in her trembling hands. She bypassed the visitor sign and sheet and walked straight up to the head administrative assistant. right there in front of the parent volunteers, the office staff, and the open door of the principal's suite where the superintendent was sitting. Brenda began to loudly and hysterically sob. She did not just cry, she wailed. She begged the office staff for help, claiming she had nowhere else to turn. When the superintendent stepped out of the office to see what the commotion was about, Brenda immediately latched on to him. She introduced herself as Julian's mother and launched into a horrifying, entirely fabricated story. She claimed that she was a victim of severe elder abuse and financial exploitation. She told the superintendent that Julian and his wealthy, ruthless wife had completely abandoned her, stolen her life savings, and were currently trying to illegally force her out of her home. She cried that she could not afford her basic medications and that Julian had threatened to physically harm her if she ever reached out to him for help. In a public school setting, administrators are legally mandated reporters. When an elderly woman stands in the main office and loudly accuses the school principal of financial and emotional abuse, the district cannot simply ignore it. The superintendent immediately called for a closed-door emergency meeting. Julian was pulled out of a classroom observation by the school resource officer. He was escorted down the hallway, not as the respected leader of the school, but as a potential liability. When he walked into the main conference room, he found the superintendent sitting at the head of the table, looking incredibly stern, with a representative from Human Resources dialed in on the speakerphone. Sitting in the corner, dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue and looking like a terrified victim, was his mother. The superintendent did not mince words. He informed Julian that these were catastrophic allegations of moral turpitude. He explained that if there was even a fraction of truth to Brenda's claims of elder abuse and financial extortion, Julian would be immediately placed on unpaid administrative leave, pending a full police investigation. The superintendent asked Julian to explain why his mother was sitting in the school office claiming she was destitute and afraid for her safety. Julian stood absolutely still. He looked at the superintendent, then he slowly turned his head to look at the woman who gave birth to him. For 34 years, Julian had carried the heavy burden of being the good son. He had absorbed her criticisms, tolerated her manipulation, and constantly tried to earn a love that was always strictly conditional. Even after she legally disinherited him to pay off Chloe's luxury debts, Julian had still harbored a tiny, painful shred of guilt. He had still wondered if he could have handled the Sunday dinner differently to keep the family intact. But in that conference room, watching his mother actively attempt to strip away his livelihood, his passion, and his ability to provide for his own family, just to punish him, that lingering guilt instantly evaporated. The illusion of the loving matriarch burned away, leaving nothing but the cold reality of a vindictive stranger. Julian reached his absolute breaking point. He did not feel sad anymore. He felt a profound, liberating clarity. Julian did not panic. He did not yell. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his cell phone. He opened the secure cloud drive folder I had set up for him just days prior. He placed the phone flat on the table and slid it across the polished wood directly to the superintendent. He told the superintendent to look at the screen. He calmly explained that the woman crying in the corner was not destitute. He stated she was the sole executor of a multi-million-dollar estate and lived in a fully paid-off luxury home. He showed the superintendent the high-resolution photographs of the legal documents from the family attorney, clearly showing that Brenda had voluntarily signed over a $4.5 million commercial logistics company to her daughter just last week. He then played a voicemail on speakerphone. It was a recording of Brenda from 3 days ago screaming at Julian, threatening to come to his job and ruin his life if he did not force me to pay Chloe's $80,000 credit card bill. The audio recording filled the quiet conference room. Brenda's vicious, extortive tone was undeniable. The superintendent listened to the entire recording, scrolled through the legal documents, and then looked up at Brenda. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The HR representative on the phone cleared her throat and stated that this appeared to be a personal extortion attempt, not a matter of elder abuse. Brenda realized her trap had failed. The fake tears stopped immediately. She sat up straight, her face hardening into a furious scowl, and began to aggressively argue that the documents were fake and that Julian was lying. But the superintendent held up his hand, silencing her completely. He informed Brenda that filing a false report of abuse to damage a district employee's reputation was a serious offense. He told her she needed to leave the premises immediately, or he would have the school resource officer arrest her for trespassing and disturbing the peace. Julian did not wait for the officer. He walked over to the door, opened it wide, and looked his mother dead in the eye. He told her to get up. Brenda grabbed her purse and marched toward the door, glaring fiercely at Julian. As she stepped out into the hallway, Julian followed her, walking her all the way to the front entrance of the school. When they reached the glass doors, Brenda turned around, preparing to deliver one last venomous threat. But Julian cut her off before she could even open her mouth. His voice was terrifyingly calm and completely devoid of any affection. He told her that she had finally succeeded in completely destroying their relationship. He said she was no longer his mother, and he was no longer her son. He informed her that if she ever stepped foot on his campus again, if she ever drove past his house, or if she ever attempted to contact him or his wife, he would file a permanent restraining order and press charges for harassment. He told her that she chose Chloe, and now she would have to live with the consequences of that choice forever. Julian turned to the armed school resource officer standing nearby and officially instructed him to permanently ban Brenda from the property. Then he turned his back on her, walked inside, and let the heavy glass doors lock behind him. He did not look back to see her reaction. He was finally entirely free. When Julian came home that evening and told me exactly what happened, I felt a deep surge of pride. The last remaining tether to their toxic manipulation had been severed. Julian and I were now a completely unified front, entirely detached from their emotional chaos. We could finally focus purely on the business at hand. We were no longer family members arguing over a dinner table. We were a private equity firm managing a highly volatile commercial asset. As the days passed, Brenda and Chloe continued to live in their fantasy world. Chloe drove her new G-Wagon around town, completely ignoring the massive operational fires burning at her logistics company. With the loss of their biggest vendor, the company warehouse was essentially empty. The remaining drivers were quitting because their paychecks were bouncing, and the commercial utility bills for the massive property were piling up rapidly. But Chloe refused to acknowledge the reality. She honestly believed that simply holding the title of CEO would magically generate revenue. Then the calendar page finally flipped. It was the first day of the month. In the high-stakes world of commercial lending, there is no empathy, no leniency, and absolutely no room for error. When David structured Chloe's massive cash advance, he mandated an automatic clearinghouse draft for the monthly repayment. The terms were explicit. On the first of every month at exactly midnight, our corporate banking system would automatically reach into Chloe's business accounts and extract a massive sum of capital to service the debt. I arrived at my office at Oak Capital early that morning, holding a fresh cup of coffee. I booted up my dual monitors and opened the secure internal dashboard that tracked our high-risk portfolio accounts. I navigated directly to the file labeled with the name of the family logistics company. I watched the screen as the automated system initiated the transaction protocol. The digital ledger attempted to pull the required $50,000 monthly payment from Chloe's primary business checking account. The system processed the request, pinging her external bank. For a few seconds, the loading icon spun in a continuous circle. Then the screen flashed a brilliant, unforgiving red. The transaction was firmly rejected. The status code displayed in bold letters across my monitor: insufficient funds. Chloe did not have the money. The massive loan repayment had completely bounced. The automated system instantly flagged the account, shifting its status from active to severely delinquent. The trap had officially sprung shut. The razor-thin legal grace period began ticking down, and I picked up my desk phone to call my legal team. The trap had officially sprung shut. The razor-thin legal grace period began ticking down, and I picked up my desk phone to call my legal team. While my lawyers began drafting the preliminary notices of default, the reality of the bounced $50,000 payment hit Chloe's bank account like a freight train. The bank did not just reject the transfer. They froze her operating lines of credit due to suspicious insolvency. Overnight, the grand illusion of her logistics empire completely shattered. The company warehouse, once a bustling hub of diesel engines and loading docks, turned into a graveyard of broken machinery and furious employees. Because Chloe had drained the cash reserves to fund her luxury shopping sprees and nightclub appearances, she had completely ignored the routine maintenance schedules for the aging fleet of delivery trucks. Commercial vehicles require constant upkeep, and without it, they fail fast. On Tuesday morning, 3 trucks broke down on the interstate, their engines blowing out because the oil had not been changed in months. The towing fees alone were astronomical. On Wednesday, the remaining truck drivers, who were already furious about their delayed overtime pay, arrived at the dispatch center only to discover their regular paychecks had also bounced. In the commercial trucking industry, drivers do not work for free. They dropped their keys on the dispatch counter, walked out of the facility, and reported the company to the state labor board. The rapid operational collapse sent shockwaves through the estate. Brenda, who had spent the last 2 weeks proudly telling her church friends that her daughter was a prodigy CEO, was suddenly fielding angry phone calls from unpaid utility companies threatening to shut off the power to the massive warehouse. Chloe was in a state of absolute panic. She sat at her father's old oak desk in the warehouse office, staring at a mountain of past due invoices, final notices, and threatening letters from independent contractors. She had absolutely no idea how to read a basic profit and loss statement, let alone navigate a severe liquidity crisis. She was a woman who thought running a business just meant cashing checks and taking photos for social media. Desperation breeds audacity. Realizing they were drowning in a financial mess they could not comprehend, Brenda and Chloe decided they needed a savior. They needed someone who actually understood accounting, someone who could untangle the chaotic web of bounced checks, negotiate with angry creditors, and magically save the family legacy. They needed the very man they had ruthlessly disinherited just a few weeks prior. They needed Julian. The love-bombing campaign began on Thursday evening. It was incredibly pathetic and entirely predictable. Julian and I were sitting in our living room enjoying a quiet dinner when his cell phone began to light up continuously. First, it was a barrage of text messages from Chloe. She sent pictures from their childhood, accompanied by long, overly emotional paragraphs about how much she missed her big brother. She claimed she was just overwhelmed and needed his brilliant business mind to help her look over some confusing paperwork. She typed that she knew they had some disagreements recently, but at the end of the day, family sticks together. 10 minutes later, Brenda's name flashed on the screen. She left a sickly sweet voicemail, completely ignoring the fact that she had just tried to destroy his career and get him fired from his high school. Her voice dripped with fake maternal affection. She called him her handsome boy and begged him to come over to the estate for a home-cooked meal. She said she had baked his favorite peach cobbler and wanted to sit down as a family to discuss bringing him back into the company as an unpaid financial consultant. She framed it as an opportunity for him to earn back her trust. Julian listened to the voicemail on speakerphone. He did not look angry. He just looked deeply exhausted by their relentless delusion. He placed his phone on the coffee table and leaned back on the couch, shaking his head. He had no intention of answering, but the phone immediately started ringing again. It was Brenda calling for the 3rd time in 15 minutes. I reached across the table and picked up his phone. Julian looked at me, a silent question in his eyes, and I simply nodded. I pressed the green accept button and brought the phone to my ear. Brenda launched right into her script the second the line connected. "Oh, Julian, thank goodness you answered," she cooed, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. "We are in a little bit of a tight spot with the warehouse accounting, and your sister is just so stressed. We need you to come down here tomorrow morning and sort out these vendor invoices. It will only take a few hours of your time, and we really need you to step up for the family." I let her finish her entire performance. I did not interrupt. When she finally paused to take a breath, I spoke. My voice was flat, cold, and entirely devoid of emotion. "Julian is currently unavailable," I stated clearly, "and he will remain unavailable to you permanently." There was a sharp gasp on the other end of the line. Brenda snapped, her fake sweet tone vanishing instantly, replaced by her usual venom. "Put my son on the phone right now. This is a private family business matter, and it has absolutely nothing to do with you." I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out into the quiet street. I told Brenda that she was absolutely right. It was her family business matter, which meant it was entirely her problem. I calmly reminded her of the meeting in the parlor with the family lawyer. I reminded her of the thick stack of legal documents she forced Julian to sign under duress. I quoted her exact words back to her. "You told Julian he was no longer fit to manage the family assets," I said, making sure every syllable landed with maximum impact. "You stripped him of his 50% stake. You handed 100% of the shares, the physical assets, and the operational liabilities directly to Chloe. You cut him out, Brenda. You made your bed, and now the mattress is on fire." Brenda started to yell, screaming that I was a vindictive witch and that Julian owed his father to save the company. She said the trucks were breaking down and the drivers had quit. She demanded that Julian come fix it because he knew how the dispatch software worked. I cut her off mid-sentence. "You own 100% of the mess now," I told her. "Do not ever call this number again expecting free labor to save a company you stole." I pressed the end call button and immediately blocked her number from Julian's phone. I then blocked Chloe's number for good measure. I set the phone back on the table. Julian looked at me, let out a long, heavy breath, and finally smiled. The boundary was set in stone. We were completely sealed off from their sinking ship. Back at the logistics warehouse, my refusal to hand over Julian sent Chloe into a blind, terrifying panic. She had less than 48 hours before the 10-day grace period on her massive commercial loan expired. If she did not deposit $50,000 in cash by Monday morning, Oak Capital would initiate immediate foreclosure proceedings. They would seize the trucks, lock the warehouse doors, and repossess her brand-new G-Wagon. The image of the tow trucks hauling away her luxury car in front of her neighbors was a humiliation she simply could not bear. She needed cash, and she needed it instantly. Since all traditional banks had frozen her credit, Chloe had to venture into the dark, unregulated waters of predatory hard money lending. These were the kind of lenders who did not care about credit scores or business plans. They only cared about hard, unencumbered collateral, and they charged astronomical interest rates that were designed to force a default. Chloe found a private equity broker operating out of a strip mall office on the outskirts of the city. He agreed to wire her $150,000 in emergency cash within 24 hours, but he required a physical asset to secure the loan, and the logistics company was already heavily mortgaged to my firm. Chloe was completely out of assets in her own name, but she knew exactly where to find one. That evening, while Brenda was at choir practice complaining to the church elders about my cruelty, Chloe snuck into Brenda's master bedroom. She walked straight to the heavy steel safe hidden in the back of the walk-in closet. Chloe had known the combination since she was a teenager. She spun the dial, pulled the heavy door open, and bypassed the jewelry boxes and cash envelopes. She reached all the way to the back and pulled out a thick, fireproof folder. Inside the folder was the original unencumbered property deed to Brenda's sprawling $2 million luxury estate. Julian's father had paid the mortgage off in full 5 years before he died. It was the ultimate safety net, the crown jewel of their generational wealth, completely free and clear of any liens. Chloe took the deed, drove straight to the shady broker's office, and slammed the documents onto his desk. When the broker handed her the secondary loan contract, pointing to the blank line requiring the property owner's signature, Chloe did not even hesitate. Her hands did not shake. Driven by pure, selfish desperation to save her own fabricated image, she picked up the pen and flawlessly forged her own mother's signature on the dotted line. She had just mortgaged the roof over Brenda's head to a ruthless loan shark, trading her mother's security for a temporary lifeline. The cash was wired to her account the next morning. Chloe paid the $50,000 default to my firm, breathed a massive sigh of relief, and immediately took her G-Wagon to get a custom detail wash. She thought she had outsmarted everyone. She thought she had bought herself enough time to figure things out. But she had no idea that I saw the payment clear. I saw the source of the funds through our background monitoring systems, and I knew exactly what she had just done. The final nail had just been hammered into their coffin, and they were the ones holding the hammer. The sudden infusion of $150,000 in illicit cash gave Chloe a dangerous temporary high. A truly rational owner would have used that stolen lifeline to repair broken trucks, pay drivers, and salvage the company. But Chloe was definitely not a rational business owner. After transferring the initial $50,000 payment to my firm to temporarily stave off the immediate repossession of her vehicles, she looked at the remaining $100,000 sitting in her bank account and saw an opportunity to show off. Within just 3 weeks, elegant gold foil invitations were sent out across the entire city of Atlanta. The lavish event was billed as the grand rebranding and executive relaunch of the family logistics empire. Chloe had rented out a breathtaking rooftop venue in the heart of Buckhead, complete with panoramic views of the city skyline. She invited the local Black elite, including prominent politicians, wealthy real estate developers, church elders, and local social media personalities. She even had the audacity to send an invitation to Julian and me. Julian and I decided to attend. We went because I knew the exact timeline of her impending financial ruin, and Julian needed to see the final tragic culmination of his mother's and sister's greed with his own eyes. We dressed impeccably for the occasion. I wore a sleek, floor-length emerald green gown that cost more than Chloe's new car lease. We walked into the rooftop venue, looking like the true owners of the empire they had stolen completely, calm, unbothered, and entirely detached from their charade. The venue was a spectacular monument to financial illiteracy. A massive towering ice sculpture of a semi-truck was slowly melting near the center of the room. Brenda was holding court near the open bar wearing an incredibly loud sequined dress. She was loudly bragging to a group of church deacons about how her brilliant daughter was single-handedly revolutionizing the supply chain industry in Georgia. When Chloe spotted us walking through the crowd, her fake camera-ready smile briefly faltered. She quickly recovered her composure, grabbed a glass of champagne, and strutted over to us. She was flanked by 2 influencer friends, clearly intending to humiliate us in public. "Well, look who finally decided to show up," Chloe said loudly, making sure the people standing nearby could hear her. "I am so glad you guys could make it. I know it must be incredibly difficult for you to see the company doing so well without you, Julian. But I promise I will take good care of Dad's little trucks. We are expanding into international shipping next quarter." Julian looked at her with a blank expression. He did not engage with her taunts. I stepped forward, closing the physical distance between Chloe and me. I smiled a warm, perfectly polite smile that did not reach my eyes. "The party is absolutely stunning, Chloe," I said, keeping my voice low and conversational, meant only for her ears. "It is truly amazing what you can accomplish in just a few short weeks. I would easily estimate at least $40,000 to $50,000 for a night like this." Chloe puffed out her chest proudly. "It takes money to make money, Nia," she retorted smugly. "You would not understand. You just sit in a cubicle and play with spreadsheets all day." I tilted my head slightly, my smile never wavering. "Oh, I understand perfectly," I replied softly. "I understand how expensive it is to maintain a brand, especially when your drivers report you to the state labor board for unpaid wages." I sipped my champagne, watching her eyes widen in shock. "It is a good thing you managed to secure that secondary cash injection last month. Hard money lenders can be so incredibly useful when traditional banks freeze your operating accounts." Chloe's face immediately lost all its color. Her smug expression vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Chloe opened her mouth to speak, but she could not form a coherent word. Her hands began to shake slightly, causing the champagne in her glass to ripple. I leaned in just a fraction of an inch closer. My voice dropped to a terrifying whisper. "But you have to be careful with those unregulated brokers, Chloe. They demand hard collateral. I really hope Brenda knows that the deed to her $2 million estate is currently sitting in a strip mall safe, bearing a signature that looks remarkably like yours, but lacks her distinct penmanship. Forgery is a very serious federal offense." Chloe physically stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the carpet. She looked at me as if she had just seen a ghost. She realized in that exact moment that I was not guessing. I knew everything. I saw every single dirty, illegal move she had made in the dark. "Excuse me," Chloe stammered, her voice cracking. "I have to go check on the catering." She practically ran away from us, pushing past the wealthy guests, desperately trying to escape the reality I had just shoved in her face. Julian watched her flee, then looked down at me. "You really do not take prisoners, do you?" he asked quietly. "I never take prisoners when they are the ones who started the war," I replied simply. For the next hour, Julian and I casually mingled with the guests. We chatted with the politicians and shook hands with the real estate developers. We did not say a single negative word about Chloe or Brenda. We did not need to. We just watched the facade crack from the inside out. Chloe was a nervous wreck. She was constantly checking her phone, pacing back and forth near the kitchen doors, and completely ignoring the guests she had paid tens of thousands of dollars to impress. Brenda kept trying to pull her back onto the dance floor, oblivious to the fact that her daughter was having a silent, nervous breakdown. The evening marched steadily toward its climax. At exactly 10 o'clock, the event planner signaled the jazz band to stop playing. It was time for the grand toast. A waiter handed Chloe a microphone. She stepped up onto a small elevated stage near the center of the room. Brenda stood directly in the front row, beaming with misplaced pride, holding her glass high in the air. Chloe gripped the microphone with both hands. She was visibly trembling. She cleared her throat and looked out over the sea of wealthy, influential faces. She tried to force her fake smile back into place. "Thank you all so much for coming tonight," Chloe began, her voice shaky and pitchy over the speakers. "Tonight is a celebration of family of Black excellence and of the incredible future of our logistics company. My mother and I have worked so hard to elevate this brand to the next level. We are proving that generational wealth is alive and well in our community." The crowd murmured in polite agreement, raising their crystal glasses in the air. Chloe took a deep breath, gaining a bit of confidence from the applause. She looked directly at Julian and me, standing near the back of the room. "We have overcome so many obstacles," she continued, her voice growing slightly louder. "We have cut out the dead weight holding us back, and we are moving forward into a highly profitable new era, to the family empire." To the empire, the crowd echoed loudly, preparing to drink. Right in the middle of the toast, the silence was pierced by a sharp, rhythmic vibration. It was my smartwatch strapped tightly to my left wrist. I raised my arm and tapped the glowing screen. The notification was flagged with a bright red urgent priority banner. It was a direct, automated message from the senior underwriting software at Oak Capital. When Chloe took out that predatory loan to pay the initial $50,000 she owed my firm, she had breached a major non-negotiable covenant in our primary lending contract. Oak Capital strictly prohibited the borrower from taking on massive secondary high-interest debt against the same business entity without explicit corporate authorization. Furthermore, her second payment cycle had just attempted to clear her frozen bank accounts. It bounced instantly. The combination of the bounced payment and the illegal secondary loan triggered an immediate acceleration clause. I stared down at the glowing text on my wrist. The message was concise. The borrower account was officially 60 days in default. The grace period was permanently revoked. Foreclosure protocol was legally activated. I looked up from my watch. Chloe was staring right at me from the stage. The microphone still clutched in her hands, her glass of champagne frozen in the air. She saw the light from my screen. She saw the cold, unwavering expression on my face. She knew exactly what that notification meant. The party was over. The empire was officially mine. Julian and I did not stay for the rest of the toast. We simply turned our backs on the frozen, horrified expression on Chloe's face and walked out of the venue, the heavy glass doors closing behind us. We spent the rest of the weekend in absolute peace. I turned off my phone, slept in late, and let the automated legal and financial systems of Oak Capital do exactly what they were programmed to do. In the corporate world, the gears of asset recovery grind forward without any emotion. There is no negotiating with a computer algorithm that has registered a hard default. For Chloe and Brenda, that weekend must have been an agonizing waiting game. Chloe knew the payment had bounced. She knew she had violated the secondary loan covenants. But in her profound arrogance, she probably convinced herself that she could make a few phone calls on Monday morning, charm a bank manager, and smooth the entire situation over. She thought commercial lending worked like a retail store return policy, where if you complain loudly enough to a manager, they will bend the rules for you. She was violently incorrect. The first undeniable strike of reality happened bright and early on Tuesday morning. Chloe lived in a high-end, newly developed luxury subdivision on the north side of the city. It was the kind of neighborhood where image was everything. The driveways were lined with perfectly manicured hedges, and the residents prided themselves on their quiet, exclusive atmosphere. Chloe had spent the last 2 months terrorizing these neighbors, revving the engine of her matte black G-Wagon at all hours of the night and acting like she owned the entire block. At exactly 6:30 in the morning, the pristine silence of the neighborhood was shattered by the loud, aggressive rumble of a heavy-duty diesel engine. A massive industrial flatbed tow truck turned onto Chloe's street. It was not a stealthy operation. The truck was bright yellow, covered in flashing amber strobe lights, and equipped with a heavy hydraulic lift. Following closely behind it was a second smaller wrecker. They pulled up directly in front of Chloe's meticulously landscaped front yard. The repo agents were highly trained, bonded professionals who specialized in high-value asset recovery. They did not knock on the front door. They did not ring the doorbell. They went straight to work. Within seconds, the lead agent had backed his wrecker up to the rear bumper of the G-Wagon parked in the driveway. He jumped out of the cab, quickly sliding the heavy steel lift forks underneath the rear tires of the luxury SUV. The hydraulic motors whined loudly as the back end of the $150,000 vehicle was hoisted unceremoniously into the air. The loud mechanical noises and the flashing amber lights immediately drew the attention of the entire street. Lights began flicking on in the surrounding houses. Front doors cracked open. Neighbors holding their morning cups of coffee and wearing bathrobes stepped out onto their porches. Inside the house, the commotion finally woke Chloe. She looked out her second-story bedroom window and let out a blood-curdling scream. Chloe sprinted down the stairs and threw open her front door, running out onto the driveway, completely barefoot, wearing nothing but a pair of silk pajamas. She was frantic, waving her arms wildly in the air, screaming at the men to drop her car. She ran right up to the lead agent, threatening to call the police, claiming they were stealing her property. She demanded they unhook the vehicle immediately, yelling that she was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar logistics company and that this was a massive misunderstanding. The lead agent did not even flinch. He had repossessed cars from fake millionaires 1,000 times before. He simply held up a clipboard blocking Chloe's path and calmly advised her to step back from the active machinery for her own safety. He told her she was in default, the vehicle was legally secured collateral, and he was taking it back to the impound lot. The humiliation was instantaneous and absolute. Chloe's worst nightmare was playing out in broad daylight. She looked around frantically and realized that at least half a dozen of her wealthy neighbors were standing on their lawns, holding up their smartphones, actively recording the entire scene. The woman who had spent months bragging on social media about her incredible wealth and business acumen was now having her prized possession ripped out of her driveway, while the whole neighborhood watched. She screamed at the neighbors to stop recording, but they simply ignored her, capturing every second of her spectacular downfall. Suddenly, the front door of the house swung open again. Brenda marched out onto the porch. She had stayed the night at Chloe's house after the disastrous rebranding party to help her daughter try to figure out a plan. Brenda was wearing a velvet house robe and her hair was wrapped in a silk scarf, but she still tried to project the absolute authority of a powerful matriarch. Brenda stormed down the driveway, inserting herself directly between the tow truck and the repo agent. She puffed out her chest and began to use the exact same intimidation tactics she had used her entire life to get her way. She pointed a sharp, manicured finger right in the agent's face. She loudly demanded to know who was in charge of this ridiculous operation. She told the agent he was making a massive career-ending mistake. She claimed that their family had retained the best corporate lawyers in the city of Atlanta. She threatened to sue the towing company into bankruptcy for trespassing, emotional distress, and grand theft auto. She screamed that they had no legal right to touch the car because it belonged to a highly profitable corporate fleet. "Do you have any idea who we are?" Brenda yelled, her voice echoing down the street, providing excellent audio for the neighbors recording the incident. "You cannot just come onto private property and take what belongs to us. I am calling the police right now, and I will have you personally arrested." The lead agent sighed. He was completely unbothered by her theatrical performance. He reached into the front pocket of his heavy work jacket and pulled out a thick folded stack of legal documents. The papers were stamped with the official embossed seal of the Fulton County Superior Court. He held the stack of papers out to Brenda. He spoke with the bored, monotone voice of a man just trying to finish his shift. "Lady, you can call the police, the governor or the president if you want to," the agent said dryly. "The police were notified 30 minutes before we arrived. This is a court-ordered, judicially approved commercial repossession. The vehicle was listed as secondary collateral on a defaulted corporate loan. The grace period expired at midnight. The lien holder signed the authorization. The judge signed the writ, and we are taking the car." Brenda snatched the paperwork out of his hand, practically tearing the top page in her fury. She told him that the paperwork was obviously fabricated. She insisted that there was a clerical error at the bank and that they would have the money wired by noon. She told Chloe to go inside and get the keys so they could prove ownership. The agent signaled to his partner, who engaged the winch. The G-Wagon was dragged fully onto the street, its front tires locked and screeching against the pavement, completely out of Chloe's control. "Read the paperwork, ma'am," the agent advised, turning his back on Brenda and walking toward the cab of his truck. "It is completely airtight. If you have a problem with the repossession, you have to take it up directly with the lien holder. We just do the heavy lifting." The heavy diesel engines roared to life, drowning out Chloe's hysterical sobbing. The trucks began to pull away, carrying the matte black symbol of Chloe's fake empire down the street and out of sight. The neighbors slowly lowered their phones, whispering among themselves, the neighborhood gossip mill already working overtime. Brenda stood in the middle of the empty driveway, clutching the stack of legal documents. Her chest was heaving with indignation. She was convinced that some faceless corporate bank had made a terrible mistake, and she was already planning how she was going to scream at a customer service representative over the phone. She adjusted her reading glasses on the bridge of her nose and flipped to the front page of the court order. She needed to know exactly which bank was responsible for this outrage. She scanned past the legal jargon, the vehicle identification numbers, and the boilerplate default language. She looked for the bold text identifying the primary lien holder. Her eyes landed on the header section of the document. The color instantly drained from her face. Her jaw dropped open and her entire body went completely rigid. The arrogant, self-righteous fire in her eyes was extinguished in a single second, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending terror. Chloe, still crying on the grass, looked up at her mother. "What is it?" Chloe sobbed. "What bank is it? We can call them. We can fix this." Brenda did not look at her daughter. Her hands began to shake violently, the thick legal papers rustling loudly in the morning air. She stared at the bold black ink printed across the top of the page, her mind completely unable to process the magnitude of the trap they had walked right into. She slowly raised her head, staring blankly at the spot where the G-Wagon used to be. "It is not a bank," Brenda whispered, her voice completely hollow. She looked down at the paper again, as if hoping the words would magically change. They did not. She opened her mouth and read the header out loud, her voice cracking under the weight of the absolute truth. "The lien holder is Oak Capital Management." Brenda read, her eyes wide with shock. "Executive Director, Nia." The name hung in the crisp morning air like a death sentence. The realization hit Brenda with the force of a physical blow. There was no faceless corporate bank to negotiate with. There was no customer service manager to scream at. There was only me. And they knew with absolute certainty that I possessed exactly zero mercy for them. Narcissists do not process reality like normal human beings. When Brenda read my name on that repossession order, a rational person would have realized the game was entirely over. A rational person would have immediately called a bankruptcy attorney. But Brenda was completely incapable of admitting defeat. In her deeply twisted mind, she simply rewrote the narrative to protect her fragile ego. She convinced herself and Chloe that I was not actually the executive director in charge of the entire private equity firm. She spun a delusional web, telling the extended family that I was just a bitter mid-level corporate manager who had maliciously abused my minor administrative access to flag Chloe's account and steal her car. She truly believed that if she could just get Julian and me in a room surrounded by the entire extended family, she could use the sheer weight of public humiliation to force me to reverse the paperwork. Thanksgiving week arrived. Despite everything that had happened, Julian received an elaborate embossed invitation in the mail. It was a summons to Brenda's annual Thanksgiving cookout at the massive family estate. Julian threw the invitation directly into the kitchen trash can. He told me there was absolutely no way we were walking back into that toxic environment. But I reached into the trash, pulled the thick cardstock out, and placed it smoothly on the island counter. I told Julian we were going. I explained that when you are dealing with a rabid animal, you do not leave the job half-finished. You have to put it down permanently in front of the entire pack so that none of the other animals ever try to bite you again. Julian looked at the cold determination in my eyes and simply nodded. When we drove through the wrought iron gates of the estate on Thanksgiving afternoon, the driveway was completely packed with expensive cars belonging to aunts, uncles, and cousins from all over the country. Chloe did not have a car parked in the driveway, of course. She had told everyone her brand new G-Wagon was simply at the dealership getting a custom ceramic coating applied for the holidays. It was just another pathetic lie in a mountain of deception. We walked through the heavy double doors into the grand foyer. The house smelled incredibly rich, filled with the deep, savory aromas of roasted turkey-baked ham, macaroni and cheese, and sweet potato pie. The visual display of wealth was absolutely sickening, knowing how it was currently being funded. Brenda had clearly used the remaining cash from her illegal, predatory secondary loan to finance this massive holiday spectacle. There were lavish floral centerpieces on every table and a hired catering staff walking around serving expensive hors d'oeuvres. She was literally burning the last of her stolen money to maintain the illusion of absolute dominance. The moment Julian and I stepped into the main living area, the warm, festive atmosphere instantly froze. The smear campaign Brenda and Chloe had launched at the mega church had been ruthlessly effective. Dozens of relatives turned to look at us. The conversations abruptly stopped, replaced by hostile whispers and sideways glances. Aunties who used to hug me and ask about my career now physically turned their backs as I walked past. Cousins who Julian had tutored in high school suddenly found their shoes incredibly interesting, refusing to make eye contact. We were given the ultimate cold shoulder. It was a coordinated, deliberate effort to make us feel completely isolated and unwelcome. Julian stiffened his jaw, clenching as a particularly rude uncle deliberately bumped his shoulder while walking past without apologizing. I reached out and gently rested my hand on the small of Julian's back. I whispered to him to maintain his posture. I reminded him that these people were not his true family. They were just hostages to Brenda's financial and emotional manipulation, and their opinions held absolutely zero weight in the real world. We walked straight through the hostile crowd to the far corner of the room, completely unbothered, carrying our own dignity like an impenetrable shield. At 3 o'clock, Brenda loudly clapped her hands together, wearing a stunning burgundy velvet gown and a string of authentic pearls. She directed everyone to move into the massive formal dining room and the adjoining heated patio, where tables had been set up to accommodate the large crowd. She strategically placed Julian and me at the very end of the longest table, as far away from the head of the table as physically possible. It was a childish power play meant to symbolize our diminished status in the family hierarchy. Chloe sat directly to Brenda's right, sipping a glass of wine and refusing to look in my direction. She looked incredibly tense, the dark circles under her eyes visible even beneath her heavy professional makeup. She knew the clock was ticking. She knew the logistics company was completely dead in the water, but she was trapped in the lie her mother was forcing her to perform. Before anyone could touch the massive feast laid out before us, Brenda stood up at the head of the table. She raised her crystal glass, tapping it gently with a silver spoon to command absolute silence. Every single head in the room bowed, automatically conditioned by years of submission to the matriarch. Brenda closed her eyes and began to deliver the most passive-aggressive, weaponized prayer I had ever witnessed in my entire life. Heavenly Father, Brenda began, her voice dripping with theatrical emotion. We come before you today with hearts full of gratitude for the blessings you have bestowed upon this family. We thank you for the generational wealth that my late husband built with his bare hands. and we thank you for the strength to protect it from those who wish to tear it down. Several aunties murmured their agreement, casting dark looks in my direction. I did not bow my head. I kept my eyes wide open, staring directly at Brenda from the opposite end of the room. We ask you to touch the hearts of those who have strayed from the path of righteousness. Brenda continued, her voice rising in pitch, turning the prayer into a public sermon. We pray for those who have allowed greed, jealousy, and corporate ruthlessness to poison their souls. We pray that they see the error of their malicious ways. We ask you to humble the arrogant and bring the prodigal sons back into the loving arms of their true family before they lose everything that truly matters. She opened her eyes right on that final line and stared absolute daggers directly at me. It was a blatant public challenge. She was telling the entire room that I was the villain, and she was demanding my surrender. The extended family remained silent, holding their breath, waiting for my reaction. They expected me to shrink in my seat to look ashamed, or to angrily storm out of the room like a defeated child. I did none of those things. I slowly picked up my crystal water goblet, raised it slightly in the air toward Brenda in a mock toast, and took a slow, refreshing sip. My absolute lack of emotional response infuriated her more than any screaming match ever could. Her jaw tightened and a flash of pure hatred crossed her face before she forced her fake smile back into place. Amen. Brenda snapped loudly. Amen, the family echoed nervously. The chaotic sounds of silverware clinking against china and overlapping conversations immediately filled the room. Plates were passed around, piled high with food, but Brenda was not finished. She had not achieved the public submission she desperately craved. She waited until everyone had a full plate before she launched her final desperate offensive. Brenda looked down the length of the table and called out Julian's name, raising her voice just enough to ensure the surrounding tables fell silent to listen. Julian, Brenda called out sweetly. I think it is time we put aside this silly little misunderstanding. The holidays are about forgiveness. Your sister is doing a phenomenal job running the company, but she tells me there has been a ridiculous clerical error with some paperwork filed by Nia's office. A minor mix-up with a vehicle lease. Chloe shifted uncomfortably in her seat, gripping her wine glass so tightly her knuckles were white. Brenda continued, her tone patronizing and incredibly loud. I know Nia is just trying to impress her bosses by being strict with the rules, but family comes first. I think it is time you tell your wife to make a quick phone call and reverse whatever administrative hold she put on Chloe's account. We can forget this whole ugly situation ever happened and you can come back into the fold. She was giving Julian an ultimatum in front of 50 people. Force your wife to submit or remain an outcast forever. Julian carefully placed his fork down on his napkin. He looked at the faces of his aunts, uncles, and cousins watching him expectantly. Then he looked at his mother. His voice was completely steady and carried effortlessly across the silent room. There was no clerical error, Mother Julian stated clearly, and Nia does not need to impress her bosses. She is the boss. A collective gasp rippled through the dining room. Brenda slammed her hands flat on the table, preparing to launch into a full-blown screaming tirade to shut him down. She grabbed the large silver carving knife to cut the turkey, her face turning bright red with absolute fury. But before Brenda could utter a single syllable, a massive sweep of bright, white headlights cut through the large bay windows of the dining room. The sudden blinding light washed over the crystal glasses and the shocked faces of the extended family. The low, heavy rumble of powerful engines vibrated through the floorboards. Through the sheer dining room curtains, everyone could see the imposing silhouettes of 3 large black unmarked SUVs pulling aggressively into the circular driveway, completely blocking in the luxury cars of the visiting relatives. The dining room descended into absolute terrified silence. The carving knife slipped from Brenda's hand, clattering loudly against the fine china platter. Heavy synchronized footsteps echoed loudly on the brick steps of the front porch. The sound was deliberate and authoritative. Then the heavy brass doorbell rang. It was a long, sustained ring that echoed ominously through the massive house. Through the glass panels of the front door, visible from where Brenda stood, was the imposing figure of the Fulton County Sheriff. He was in full uniform, accompanied by 2 armed deputies. Tucked securely under his right arm was a thick, heavy stack of manila folders bearing the bright red seals of the Superior Court. The time for prayers and family gossip was officially over. The consequences had arrived. The heavy brass doorbell rang a second time, shattering the paralyzed silence of the dining room. Nobody moved. The aunties who had been whispering about me just moments ago were now frozen in their seats, staring wide-eyed at the front door. Brenda finally snapped out of her shock. She smoothed down the front of her velvet gown, plastered on her most authoritative, indignant expression, and marched toward the foyer. She was determined to treat the Fulton County Sheriff like a pesky door-to-door salesman interrupting her holiday meal. I opened the heavy front door before she could even reach it. The sheriff stepped inside his polished boots, heavy on the hardwood floor. He was a tall, no-nonsense man who looked like he had absolutely zero patience for wealthy suburban drama. Behind him walked a sharp-looking woman in a tailored navy blue suit carrying an incredibly thick black leather binder. She was the senior legal courier for Oak Capital Management, my courier. "Excuse me," Brenda demanded loudly, stepping right into the sheriff's path. "What is the meaning of this? This is a private residence, and we are in the middle of a private family Thanksgiving dinner. You cannot just barge in here. I demand you leave immediately." The sheriff did not step back. He looked down at Brenda with a completely flat expression. "Are you Brenda?" he asked, checking the top sheet of the manila folder in his hands. "I am the owner of this estate," Brenda declared proudly, lifting her chin, "and I am telling you to get out." The sheriff sighed, shaking his head slightly. "Ma'am, as of 8 o'clock yesterday morning, you are no longer the legal owner of this estate. I am here to serve a formal notice of foreclosure and immediate property seizure on behalf of the primary lien holder." The words echoed through the massive foyer and carried directly into the silent dining room. The collective gasp from the extended family was audible. Chloe, who had followed her mother out of the dining room, let out a sharp, terrified squeak and backed up against the wall. Brenda let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Foreclosure?" she scoffed. "You are out of your mind. My late husband paid this house off completely 5 years ago. We do not owe a single dime to any bank. You have the wrong address, officer. Now get out before I call your commanding officer and have your badge." That is when I made my move. I slowly pushed my chair back from the far end of the long dining table. The scraping sound of the wooden chair legs against the floor drew every single eye in the room to me. I stood up to my full height, smoothed the front of my dress, and walked calmly toward the foyer. The crowd of relatives parted from me like the Red Sea. I did not look at any of them. My eyes were locked entirely on Brenda. "He has the exact right address, Brenda," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a freshly sharpened blade. "And he is not here on behalf of a bank. He is here on behalf of me." Brenda spun around to face me, her face contorting with a mixture of absolute confusion and rising panic. "What are you talking about?" she snapped. "This is another one of your sick little games, Nia. Tell this man to leave." I stopped walking when I was standing right beside the sheriff. I looked at the legal courier, who immediately stepped forward and handed me the heavy black leather binder. I held it in both hands, feeling the satisfying weight of their complete financial destruction. I looked over at Chloe, who was hyperventilating against the wall, and then I locked eyes with Brenda, "This is not a game, Brenda," I said, my voice projecting clearly so that every single aunt, uncle, and cousin could hear exactly what I was saying. "I am ending the game. You thought you were so incredibly smart when you ambushed us at dinner last month. You thought you could use the family business to force me to pay off Chloe's luxury debts. And when Julian refused to let you extort me, you thought you delivered the ultimate punishment. You disinherited him." I took a slow, deliberate step closer to her. Brenda tried to hold her ground, but I could see the absolute terror bleeding into her eyes. "You did not disinherit Julian to save Chloe," I told her, enunciating every single word with cold, calculated precision. "You handed Chloe the rope to hang yourselves. You gave an incompetent, arrogant child 100% ownership of a highly volatile commercial asset. And what was the very first thing she did with that asset? She walked straight into a commercial lending firm and mortgaged the entire family empire for a quick cash advance so she could buy designer bags and a new car." The dining room erupted into shocked murmurs. Uncles were whispering fiercely to each other. Aunties were clutching their chests. They were finally hearing the truth that Brenda had fought so hard to hide. Brenda opened her mouth to argue, but she had absolutely no defense. She just stared at me, her chest heaving. But she did not just walk into any lending firm. I continued, my voice rising just enough to silence the murmuring crowd. She walked into Oak Capital Management. My firm, the firm where I am the executive director. I saw her application hit my desk. I saw her falsified income projections. I saw the legal transfer deeds you forced Julian to sign. I knew she would immediately default. And I personally approved the loan. The silence that followed that statement was deafening. The sheer magnitude of the trap they had walked into finally crashed down on them. Chloe let out a loud, pathetic sob and slid down the wall, burying her face in her hands. She knew it was over. "I am here to collect Brenda," I said softly. I turned to the large wooden credenza sitting in the hallway. I raised the heavy black binder high in the air and dropped it flat onto the polished wood. The massive thud echoed like a gunshot. I flipped the binder open. It was packed with hundreds of pages of perfectly organized, legally certified receipts. "This is the default notice for the $50,000 payment your daughter bounced on the first of the month," I announced, tapping the top document. "This is the official termination letter from the retail vendor that abandoned your company because Chloe let their cargo rot in the sun while she was day drinking at a country club. And this is the repossession order for the G-Wagon that was towed out of her driveway on Tuesday morning. The one you told everyone was getting a ceramic coating." I flipped to the next section of the binder. The crowd of relatives was inching closer, completely captivated by the brutal execution of justice. They wanted to see the proof. "But that is just the business," I said, turning my gaze back to Brenda. "Now let us talk about your house." Because when Chloe realized she was about to lose her car, she went to a predatory hard money lender to secure an illegal secondary cash loan. She needed collateral. So she broke into your safe. She stole the original deed to this very house. And she forged your signature on the mortgage documents. Brenda physically staggered backward. She looked down at Chloe, her own flesh and blood weeping on the floor. "Chloe," Brenda whispered, her voice completely broken. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not do that." Chloe just sobbed louder, refusing to look up. She curled into a tight ball of pure shame. "She is not lying, Brenda." Julian spoke up. He walked out of the dining room and stood right next to me. He looked at his mother with absolute disgust. He did not look like a son seeking approval anymore. He looked like a man who had finally realized his own worth. "You chose her," Julian said quietly. "You chose to protect her lies. You tried to get me fired from my job. You tried to ruin my wife's reputation at our church. You sacrificed my father's entire legacy just to keep up appearances, and now you have absolutely nothing left." I turned back to the binder and pulled out the final document. It was the foreclosure notice the sheriff had just handed me. Because Chloe defaulted on the primary loan, the cross-collateralization clauses were immediately activated. I explained analytically, destroying her with corporate law. We legally absorbed the secondary debt. Oak Capital now owns the logistics company, the warehouse, the commercial truck fleet, and this $2 million estate. You are currently standing on my property. Brenda looked around the room. She looked at the faces of her extended family. She was looking for a savior. She was looking for an uncle to step forward and defend her, or an auntie to scold me for being disrespectful. But nobody moved. The receipts were sitting right there on the table. The proof of Chloe's forgery, the proof of the massive debt, the proof of Brenda's lies. They were all exposed to the light, and the family was disgusted. The woman who had ruled the family with an iron fist, who had used money to control and manipulate everyone around her, was suddenly completely powerless. The reality of her situation finally hit her. She had lost her company. She had lost her house. She had lost her golden child to federal fraud charges. And she had lost her son forever. She had absolutely no leverage left. She was cornered, trapped by her own toxic arrogance. When a narcissist realizes they have completely lost control of the narrative, they will do absolutely anything to stop the truth from being spoken. They will change the subject. They will attack your character, or when all else fails, they will manufacture a crisis to force you to feel sorry for them. Brenda looked at the cold, unforgiving faces staring back at her. She realized she could not argue her way out of this. She could not intimidate the sheriff. So she resorted to the most desperate, pathetic manipulation tactic in her arsenal. She let out a sudden, highly dramatic gasp. Her hands flew up to her chest, clutching the expensive pearls around her neck. Her eyes rolled back into her head and her knees suddenly buckled. "Oh, Lord," Brenda wailed loudly, her voice trembling with exaggerated pain. My heart is giving out." She collapsed heavily into one of the velvet entryway chairs, slumping over the armrest and panting loudly. She gripped the fabric of her dress, thrashing her head back and forth. "I cannot breathe," she gasped, looking pleadingly at the crowd of relatives. "The stress. She is killing me. Somebody call an ambulance. My heart is stopping." She squeezed her eyes shut and let out a long, theatrical groan, fully expecting the entire room to rush to her side, push me out of the way, and beg her to hold on. She thought this fake medical emergency would instantly stop the foreclosure, invalidate the receipts, and make me look like a monster for stressing out a poor, sick, elderly woman on Thanksgiving Day. She thought she had found her escape hatch. One of the older uncles, genuinely terrified by Brenda's theatrical performance, frantically pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911. He shouted his location to the emergency dispatcher, his voice cracking with panic, completely convinced that he was watching the matriarch of the family die right in the middle of the foyer. Several aunties rushed forward, kneeling beside the velvet chair, fanning Brenda's face with napkins and begging her to hold on. Through all of this chaotic panic, Julian and I did not move a single muscle. The sheriff did not move either. He simply rested his hand on his duty belt, his expression completely blank, watching the spectacle with the exhausted eyes of a man who dealt with wealthy, entitled criminals on a daily basis. He recognized a delay tactic when he saw one. Because we were in a highly affluent, heavily gated suburb, the emergency response time was incredibly fast. Within 5 minutes, the piercing wail of ambulance sirens joined the flashing lights of the police cruisers parked outside. 2 paramedics burst through the front doors carrying heavy medical bags and a portable electrocardiogram monitor. The family members quickly scattered, making room for the medical professionals to do their jobs. Brenda ramped up her performance the second the paramedics approached. She let out weak, breathless groans, clutching her left arm and fluttering her eyelids. She was desperately trying to force her body to mimic the symptoms of a massive cardiac event. The lead paramedic, a seasoned professional with a highly clinical demeanor, immediately knelt beside her. He did not offer any words of comfort. He quickly attached the sticky EKG sensors to her wrists and the upper portion of her chest. He wrapped a blood pressure cuff tightly around her upper arm and slipped a pulse oximeter onto her index finger. The machine powered on, emitting a series of sharp, rhythmic beeps. The entire dining room held its collective breath. The family stared at the small digital screen, expecting to see a chaotic, failing heart rhythm. The paramedic stared at the monitor for several long seconds. He checked the blood pressure reading. He looked at the oxygen saturation levels. Then his clinical expression turned into a hard, deeply annoyed frown. He reached up and pulled the sensors off Brenda's wrists in one swift motion. He stood up, looking directly at the anxious crowd of relatives, and spoke with a loud, incredibly irritated voice. "Her vitals are absolutely perfect," the paramedic announced, his voice echoing through the silent foyer. "Her blood pressure is slightly elevated due to adrenaline, but her heart rhythm is strong and steady. Her oxygen saturation is at 100%. She is not having a heart attack. She is not even close to having a heart attack. This is a theatrical display of stress, and she is completely faking it." The silence that followed his medical declaration was absolute. The machine did not lie. The paramedic began packing up his equipment, shaking his head in disgust at the massive waste of county emergency resources. The reaction from the extended family was instantaneous and brutal. The genuine fear and concern they had felt just moments ago morphed directly into pure, unadulterated revulsion. The aunties who had been fanning Brenda slowly stood up, their faces hardening into masks of absolute contempt. An uncle in the back row let out a loud, mocking scoff. "She is faking a medical emergency to avoid the police." An older cousin whispered loudly, the disgust dripping from every syllable. How incredibly pathetic. Brenda realized her ultimate escape hatch had just been slammed completely shut. The paramedics had stripped away her final layer of defense, exposing her as a fraud in front of the very people she had spent decades trying to impress. She slowly opened her eyes. She did not look weak anymore. The fake pain vanished, replaced by a dark-cornered, incredibly dangerous glare. I stepped forward, closing the physical distance between us until I was standing right over her. I was not going to let her breathe. I was not going to let her spin another lie. I reached into the heavy black binder still sitting on the credenza and pulled out the physical original copy of the secondary loan agreement. I held the thick contract right in front of her face, forcing her to look at the ink. "The fake heart attack is not going to save you, Brenda," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "You need to look at this paper. You need to see exactly what your precious golden child did to you." Brenda stared at the document. Her eyes locked onto the signature line at the very bottom of the page. It was her name written in a handwriting that was just slightly too shaky, slightly too forced. It was Chloe's desperate forgery glaring right back at her. Chloe did not just bankrupt the company, I revealed, my words striking her like physical blows. She forged your name and mortgaged this very house to a predatory loan shark to pay for her luxury lifestyle. And because she defaulted on everything, my firm bought the debt. You do not own the logistics company anymore, Brenda. And as of 8 o'clock this morning, you do not own this house either. The absolute finality of my words broke the last remaining thread of Brenda's sanity. The reality of her total financial annihilation finally set in. She was homeless, completely broke, and publicly humiliated. And the person responsible for the final fatal blow was not me. It was the daughter she had sacrificed everything to protect. Brenda's head snapped toward the wall where Chloe was still cowering on the floor. The loving, protective matriarch instantly transformed into a vicious, raging monster. Narcissists have no true loyalty. The moment their golden child becomes a liability, they will tear them apart with zero hesitation. Brenda lunged out of the chair, her velvet gown twisting around her legs. She pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at her daughter. "You stole from me!" Brenda screamed, her voice cracking with hysterical rage. "You little thief! I gave you a multi-million-dollar company. I gave you everything you ever asked for. And you went behind my back and stole my home. You forged my signature like a common criminal. You ruined me." Chloe flinched, but the cornered, desperate panic inside her suddenly ignited into an equally vicious rage. Chloe had learned every single one of her manipulative, toxic traits directly from the woman screaming at her. She was not going to sit on the floor and take the blame alone. She scrambled to her feet, her designer makeup smeared across her face, completely abandoning the victim act. "I did not ruin you!" Chloe screamed back, her voice echoing wildly against the high ceilings of the foyer. "You ruined yourself. You forced me to do this. You forged my name!" Brenda shrieked, taking a step toward her daughter with her hands balled into tight fists. "Because you made me keep up appearances," Chloe fired back, matching her mother's aggressive energy step for step. "You never taught me how to actually run a business. You just wanted a shiny trophy to brag about at your stupid church. You told me to project wealth. You told me that image was everything. If I had lost that G-Wagon, if the neighbors had seen me fail, you would have been so embarrassed you would have disowned me anyway." The ugly, toxic truth of their entire relationship was spilling out into the open for everyone to see. There was no love between them. There was only a shared sickness, a mutual obsession with status, and a deep, rotting core of selfishness. "I only did exactly what you taught me to do," Chloe yelled, pointing right back at her mother. "You taught me to use people to get what I want. You used Julian to try and get Nia's money. I just used your house to get mine. We are exactly the same." Brenda let out a guttural sound of pure fury and raised her hand, fully intending to physically strike her own daughter across the face right in front of the police. The sheriff immediately stepped forward, placing his large hand firmly on Brenda's shoulder and pushing her back verbally, warning her to stand down or face immediate assault charges. The extended family watched the vicious screaming match with absolute horror. The illusion of the perfect, wealthy, God-fearing family was completely shattered, leaving behind a pathetic, toxic wasteland. The respect and fear Brenda had cultivated for 30 years vanished into thin air. Nobody stepped forward to comfort them. Nobody offered to mediate the dispute. The family members simply began to move. Uncles quietly grabbed their coats from the hall closet. Aunties picked up their expensive purses, keeping their heads down, completely refusing to make eye contact with Brenda or Chloe. The cousins quickly shuffled out the front door, slipping past the police deputies and the paramedics. Brenda noticed the mass exodus. She spun around, desperately reaching out toward her older sister, who was buttoning up her winter coat. "Where are you going?" Brenda demanded, her voice bordering on a frantic plea. "We are right in the middle of dinner. You cannot leave me like this. You are family. We have to stick together." Her older sister paused at the door. She turned around and looked at Brenda with an expression of pure, unadulterated pity. "We are not family," Brenda, her sister, said coldly. "Family protects each other. You and your daughter just destroy everything you touch. Do not call me when you need a place to stay tonight." With that final devastating statement, the sister walked out the door. Within 3 minutes, the massive house was entirely empty of guests. The driveway cleared out as the luxury cars sped away, leaving Brenda and Chloe completely isolated, standing in the ruins of the empire they had selfishly destroyed. They had nobody left to manipulate. They had absolutely no one to blame but themselves. And the sheriff was still standing right there, holding the manila folders, waiting for me to give the final order. I turned to the sheriff and gave him a single sharp nod of authorization. He stepped forward, his heavy boots echoing loudly in the now cavernous, completely silent foyer. He did not hand the papers to Brenda with any degree of sympathy or hesitation. He thrust the thick manila folders directly toward her chest, forcing her to instinctively raise her shaking hands to take them. "Brenda," the sheriff said, his voice entirely devoid of the respect she constantly demanded from the world, "consider yourself formally served. As the legal representative of the primary lien holder, Oak Capital Management has executed an immediate writ of possession. Because this property was pledged as collateral under fraudulent terms, which subsequently defaulted, standard eviction timelines have been completely bypassed by the presiding judge." Brenda stared blindly at the paperwork. Her hands were shaking so violently that the thick legal papers rustled like dry leaves in the wind. "Expedited." She repeated the words, sounding entirely foreign on her tongue. "What does that mean? Where are we supposed to go?" I stepped right up to her, invading her personal space, ensuring she had no choice but to look me directly in the eyes. "It means you do not get 30 days, Brenda," I said, my voice ringing with cold, absolute authority. "You do not get 2 weeks. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate these premises. By Saturday evening at exactly 6 o'clock, a private security firm will arrive to execute a complete physical lockdown of this estate. Every door will be chained. Every lock will be replaced." I paused, letting the devastating reality sink into her mind before delivering the final financial condition. "Furthermore, because you use this estate to secure a commercial loan, all high-value fixtures, antique furniture, and luxury goods currently sitting inside this house are now legally considered seized corporate assets. You are allowed to take your clothing and basic personal necessities. If you attempt to load a moving truck with the artwork, the electronics, or the silver, you will be immediately charged with grand larceny." Brenda let out a ragged, desperate breath. The arrogant, untouchable matriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified, broken woman. She looked at me, tears streaming down her face, and actually attempted to grab my arm. I stepped back smoothly, entirely avoiding her physical touch. "Nia, please," Brenda begged, her voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "You cannot do this to me. We are family. Where is your Christian grace? Where is your forgiveness? It is Thanksgiving. You cannot throw an elderly woman out into the street on a holiday weekend. We can work this out. I can get a job. I can pay you back. Just give me a second chance." I looked at her with an expression made of absolute stone. I felt zero pity. I knew that if the roles were reversed, she would have crushed me without a second thought. I was not about to offer any toxic forgiveness. "Do not ever use the word family with me again," I replied, my voice icy and precise. "You use the concept of family as a weapon to extort us. You used your religion as a shield to hide your own massive greed. When you thought you had all the power, you looked Julian in the eyes and told him you were going to strip him of his legacy just because he would not let you abuse me. You did not offer us a second chance when you disinherited him. You did not offer grace when you went to his school and tried to get him fired from his job. You demanded our complete submission. I gestured toward the massive, lavishly decorated dining room, where the abandoned, expensive turkey was still sitting on the table. You literally burned through stolen money to throw a party just to try and humiliate me. This is not a family dispute anymore, Brenda. This is a strictly enforced corporate foreclosure. There is no forgiveness because this is a business transaction. You made a terrible investment in your daughter and now you are completely bankrupt. You have 48 hours. When Brenda realized that my boundaries were completely impenetrable, she physically crumbled. She sank down onto the bottom step of the grand sweeping staircase, burying her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably. The reality of her total ruin had finally taken root. Seeing her mother completely defeated on the stairs, Chloe realized she was entirely out of options. She had no car, no company, no money, and now no home. The predatory, hard money lenders she had borrowed from would soon be hunting her for the remaining balance. She turned her wild, panicked eyes toward the only person left in the room who had ever shown her unconditional grace. She turned to Julian. Chloe dropped entirely to her knees. It was a pathetic, degrading display, but she had absolutely no dignity left to preserve. She crawled forward across the polished hardwood floor, her expensive designer dress bunching up around her thighs, her professional makeup running down her face in thick black streaks. She stopped right at Julian's feet. She reached out with trembling hands and tightly gripped the fabric of his trousers. "Julian, please!" Chloe wailed, her voice a hysterical screech. "You have to stop her. You have to talk to Nia. Please, Julian. I am your little sister. I am your blood. You used to protect me when we were kids. You promised Dad you would always look out for me. Please, big brother, do not let her do this to us. I have nowhere to go. I will go to jail. Please save me." She rested her forehead against his shoes, weeping loudly, desperately hoping that this physical display of ultimate submission would trigger his lifelong habit of rescuing her. For 30 years, her tears had been her absolute most effective weapon. Whenever Chloe cried, Julian fixed the problem. Whenever Chloe failed, Julian cleaned up the mess. She was aggressively gambling her entire future on the hope that his childhood conditioning was stronger than his newfound self-respect. Julian stood perfectly still. He did not step back, but he also did not reach down to comfort her. He simply looked down at the top of her head. The heavy silence stretched out in the grand foyer, broken only by Chloe's ragged, desperate sobbing. When Julian finally spoke, his voice was not angry. It was not sad. It was completely terrifyingly hollow. It was the voice of a man speaking to a total stranger on the street. "You did not think about Dad when you forged Mom's signature to steal this house," Julian said quietly, the calmness of his tone making the words cut even deeper. "You did not think about me being your big brother when you stood in the parlor last month wearing your designer sunglasses and mocked me for losing my inheritance. You laughed right in my face, Chloe. You told me you owned the empire." Chloe shook her head violently against his legs, her grip tightening on his pants. "I was wrong. I was so stupid. I am sorry, Julian. I am so sorry. Just tell her to stop the foreclosure. Tell her to give us the house back. I will do anything you want." Julian reached down. For a split second, Chloe stopped crying, truly believing he was going to pull her up into a warm hug. She thought she had successfully manipulated him again. But Julian simply grabbed her wrists, his grip incredibly firm and completely unyielding, and physically peeled her hands off his legs. He stepped back, breaking all physical contact with her. He looked down at his sister, his expression a perfect mirror of the cold professional detachment I had maintained all evening. He was finally utilizing the exact same emotional armor I wore every single day. "I am not your big brother anymore," Julian stated, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "A brother is someone you respect. A brother is someone you protect. You treated me like an obstacle to your greed, and then you treated me like an ATM machine when your poor choices caught up with you. I am completely done carrying the weight of your mistakes." He paused, letting the profound weight of his detachment settle over her completely. He looked her dead in the eyes and delivered the final, inescapable truth, using the exact words she and her mother had weaponized against him just weeks ago. "I guess you'll have to figure it out," Julian said, his tone perfectly flat. "You're cut off." The words hit Chloe like a physical shockwave. The rejection was absolute. The safety net was permanently destroyed. She stared up at Julian, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. She looked from Julian to her mother weeping on the stairs, and then finally to me. I was standing near the credenza, watching the entire scene with my arms casually crossed over my chest. I did not look triumphant. I did not look smug. I just looked incredibly bored, as if watching them lose everything was just another tedious corporate meeting at the office. That absolute lack of emotional response was the spark that ignited the final powder keg. Chloe could not handle the humiliation. She could not handle the brutal rejection. But most of all, her deeply ingrained narcissistic ego could not handle the fact that I was completely unaffected by her suffering. Her profound sorrow and desperation instantly mutated into a blind, feral, homicidal rage. Chloe let out a scream that did not even sound human. It was a raw, guttural shriek of pure, unadulterated hatred. She pushed herself off the floor with explosive force. She did not run toward the door. She did not run toward her mother. She locked her wild, bloodshot eyes entirely on me. Her hands curled into tight claws aiming directly for my face. She lunged across the foyer, her expensive heels slipping slightly on the hardwood, propelling her body forward with violent momentum. "I am going to kill you!" she shrieked, launching herself through the air toward the credenza. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I did not even uncross my arms. I knew exactly who was standing right behind me. Before Chloe could even cross half the distance between us, the sheriff moved with terrifying, practiced speed. He was a large, heavily muscled law enforcement officer, and Chloe was a frantic, out-of-shape amateur. It was not even a contest. The sheriff intercepted her trajectory mid-lunge. He grabbed her aggressively by the shoulder and the back of her designer dress, using her own forward momentum against her. He spun her violently around and slammed her face first right into the solid wooden surface of the dining room table. The impact was incredibly loud. Crystal glasses shattered instantly, scattering sharp fragments across the floor. The remaining china plates rattled violently against the wood. Chloe screamed in pain and shock, instantly trying to thrash her body around to escape. "Get off me! Let me go! Stop resisting! Stop resisting right now!" The sheriff barked, his voice a booming command that paralyzed Brenda on the stairs. He grabbed Chloe's right arm, twisting it painfully up behind her back. He reached to his duty belt with his free hand and pulled out his heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic clicking sound echoed sharply through the room as he locked the first cuff tightly around her wrist. Chloe continued to kick wildly, her heels striking the heavy wooden legs of the table. The two deputies who had been standing by the front door immediately rushed in, grabbing her thrashing legs and pinning her lower body firmly against the table. The sheriff grabbed her left arm, ignoring her hysterical screaming, and forced it behind her back, locking the second cuff into place. The clicks were loud, final, and absolute. "Chloe!" Brenda screamed from the stairs, jumping up in a complete panic. "What are you doing to her? Let my daughter go!" The sheriff ignored Brenda completely. He grabbed Chloe by the upper arms and violently hauled her up from the table. Her nose was bleeding slightly from the impact, dripping red onto her pristine dress. Her face was contorted in absolute fury and total humiliation. "You are under arrest for attempted felony assault, battery, and resisting a peace officer," the sheriff stated loudly, completely out of breath as he firmly held the struggling woman. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Chloe was hyperventilating, crying and screaming wildly as the deputies grabbed her by the arms to escort her out. She looked back at me over her shoulder, her eyes burning with sheer venom. But the venom was useless now. She was handcuffed, she was bankrupt, and she was going straight to a county jail cell. The ultimate consequences had fully arrived, and there was no one left to save her. The sheriff stood in the center of the foyer, the heavy silence of the empty house pressing in around us. He looked at me, giving a brief nod of acknowledgement, and then turned his attention back to Brenda. He reiterated the 48-hour deadline, advising her to begin packing immediately, and walked out the front door, leaving Brenda completely alone in the ruins of her own making. Julian and I did not say another word to her. We turned around, walked down the brick steps, and drove back to our quiet, peaceful home. The war was over and the cleanup was about to begin. The next 48 hours unfolded with the ruthless, unforgiving efficiency of a ticking clock. For Brenda, the reality of her eviction was a bitter, agonizing pill to swallow. She spent her entire Friday frantically calling everyone in her contacts list, desperately begging for a temporary loan, a spare guest bedroom, or even just a sympathetic ear. But the dramatic spectacle at the Thanksgiving dinner had permanently destroyed her carefully curated social standing. The prominent church elders suddenly stopped answering their phones. Her sisters and wealthy cousins actively blocked her number. Nobody wanted to be associated with a woman who had faked a medical emergency to avoid the police, let alone a woman whose daughter was sitting in a county jail cell for felony assault and massive financial fraud. With absolutely no money to hire professional movers and no friends left to help her, Brenda was forced to pack up her entire life completely on her own. Because the corporate seizure order strictly prohibited the removal of any valuable furniture, artwork, or electronics, she was reduced to stuffing her expensive designer clothes and personal toiletries into cheap, black plastic heavy-duty trash bags. The visual contrast was absolutely staggering. A woman who had spent decades draped in imported velvet and authentic pearls, looking down her nose at everyone else, was now dragging garbage bags full of shoes across the immaculate hardwood floors of a $2 million estate she no longer owned. She had to leave behind the grand piano, the antique silver sets, and the massive crystal chandeliers she had always bragged about. By late Saturday afternoon, Brenda had managed to secure a tiny rundown one-bedroom apartment on the far outskirts of the city. It was situated in a dilapidated, dangerous complex, right next to a noisy industrial highway, miles away from her affluent country club lifestyle. She loaded her trash bags into the trunk of a cheap rental sedan. As the clock struck 6 on Saturday evening, the private security firm hired by Oak Capital arrived exactly on schedule. Brenda stood shivering on the sidewalk and watched as the armed security guards placed heavy steel chains through the brass handles of the grand double doors, officially locking her out of the generational wealth she had so arrogantly squandered. While Brenda was dragging trash bags down the driveway, Chloe was experiencing her own personal hell inside the Fulton County Jail. The spoiled golden child who had spent the last month popping expensive champagne bottles in exclusive VIP lounges spent her entire Thanksgiving weekend locked inside a freezing cold concrete holding cell. Her designer silk dress was permanently ruined, stained with blood and dirt from her physical altercation with the sheriff. She was stripped of her expensive jewelry, processed like a common criminal, and forced to sit on a hard metal bench surrounded by people she usually looked down upon. Her arrogant facade completely shattered the moment the heavy iron bars slid shut. She used her single phone call to reach out to her influencer friends, crying and begging for bail money, only to discover that they had all abandoned her the second she lost her money and status. Desperate and terrified of spending another night behind bars, Chloe was forced to call a shady, high-interest bail bondsman. She managed to secure her release by maxing out the very last predatory credit card she had hidden in her wallet, taking on even more insurmountable debt just to buy her temporary freedom. She walked out of the county jail on Sunday morning wearing a pair of cheap paper scrubs provided by the facility, completely bankrupt, homeless, and facing multiple felony charges that carried mandatory prison time. Monday morning marked the beginning of a brand new era for the logistics company. I arrived at the massive commercial warehouse at exactly 8 o'clock, flanked by my senior accounting team and a squad of private security contractors. The atmosphere in the dispatch center was incredibly tense. The remaining employees, the toxic enablers who had allowed Chloe to run the business into the ground while collecting unearned paychecks, were sitting at their desks whispering nervously. They knew exactly who I was, and they knew I was not there to make friends. I did not waste time with corporate pleasantries. I called an immediate all-hands meeting on the warehouse floor. I stood in front of the remaining staff and methodically dismantled the corrupt culture Brenda and Chloe had cultivated. I fired the lazy dispatch manager who had actively ignored the retail vendor's phone calls while Chloe was day drinking. I terminated the corrupt bookkeeper who had helped Chloe manipulate the balance sheets to hide her massive cash withdrawals. I handed them their final severance checks, escorted them off the property with security, and officially purged the toxic rot from the payroll. With the dead weight completely removed my financial team, and I began the aggressive process of total liquidation. The family logistics company was no longer a viable operational business, but it possessed highly valuable hard assets. I hired a specialized commercial broker to auction off the massive fleet of delivery trucks. Because the supply chain market was currently experiencing a massive shortage of commercial vehicles, the trucks sold for a significant premium within days. We then placed the massive prime real estate warehouse up for sale, securing a highly lucrative cash offer from a national e-commerce corporation looking to expand their local distribution network. Every single penny generated from the liquidation of the trucks, the warehouse, and the eventual sale of Brenda's $2 million estate was meticulously gathered into a single corporate account. I did not keep a single dime of the profits for Oak Capital. Once the initial $50,000 defaulted loan, the secondary predatory loan, and the corporate legal fees were fully satisfied, I took the remaining millions and executed a flawless financial maneuver. I established a secure, high-yield, irrevocable trust fund, and I placed every single asset, every single dollar, and every single share of that trust entirely under Julian's name. I presented him with the leather-bound trust documents in our living room. I had not engineered this massive corporate takeover to steal his family wealth. I had engineered it to rescue the wealth from the parasites who were actively draining it and return his rightful legacy to him, completely clean and protected. A week later, the liquidation process was nearly complete. The massive commercial warehouse was almost entirely empty, completely cleared of the wooden pallets, the heavy machinery, and the decades of accumulated inventory. Julian decided to visit the property one last time before we officially handed the keys over to the new corporate buyers. He wanted to walk through the massive building his father had built from the ground up to find some semblance of personal closure before closing this dark chapter of his life forever. Julian walked slowly through the echoing empty dispatch center and pushed open the heavy wooden door to his late father's old corner office. The room had been stripped of its expensive furniture during the liquidation sale, leaving only the faded rectangular marks on the industrial carpet where the massive oak desk used to sit. Julian stood in the center of the room, breathing in the familiar scent of old paper diesel exhaust and strong coffee that always reminded him of his dad. As he turned to leave the empty office, his foot caught the edge of a loose floorboard near the back corner of the room, right where a heavy metal filing cabinet used to stand. Julian knelt down to inspect the uneven wood. He pressed his fingers against the edge of the board, and to his surprise, the wood shifted smoothly, sliding to the side to reveal a hidden, recessed cavity built directly into the concrete foundation. Inside the hidden compartment was a small, heavy steel lockbox. It was covered in a thick layer of gray dust, clearly untouched for years. Julian carefully lifted the heavy box out of the floor. The simple combination lock was set to his own birthday, a specific detail that immediately made his chest tighten with overwhelming emotion. He spun the dial's click, the heavy brass latch open, and lifted the thick steel lid. The box did not contain emergency money or secret company ledgers or forgotten stock certificates. Lying at the very bottom of the cold steel box was a single plain white envelope. Julian picked up the envelope. The paper was slightly yellowed with age. His heart began to hammer fiercely against his ribs as he recognized the sharp, slanted handwriting scrawled boldly across the front. It was his father's unmistakable penmanship. The envelope was addressed simply to Julian, but it was the date written neatly in the top right corner that made the blood freeze completely in his veins. The handwritten letter was dated exactly 2 weeks before his father suddenly passed away. Julian stared down at the sealed envelope, his hands trembling slightly, realizing that the man who built this entire empire had left behind one final, hidden truth that Brenda had never been able to destroy. Julian broke the seal on the aged envelope with trembling fingers. He pulled out a single sheet of heavy stationery crisp despite the years spent locked in the dark. He sat on the edge of the floorboard, unfolding the letter under the harsh warehouse lights. I stood quietly in the doorway, giving him space to connect with his father one last time. As Julian read the handwritten words, I watched his posture change. The residual tension and lingering doubts he had carried since that disastrous dinner began to physically melt away from his shoulders. Julian looked at me, his eyes shining with unshed tears, his expression showing profound relief. He held the letter out to me. The message was incredibly direct, written with the clear judgment of a man who knew his time was short. His father wrote that he had spent his life building the company to provide security, but he was painfully aware of the toxic reality growing inside his own home. He stated that Brenda was obsessed with the appearance of wealth rather than hard work, and Chloe was completely consumed by her own entitlement. The most vindicating paragraph was at the bottom. His father wrote that his dying wish was for Julian to take absolute control of the estate, and he specifically mentioned me. He wrote that Julian found a partner with the exact uncompromising business mind needed to protect the family legacy from vultures. He intended to legally restructure the trust to ensure Brenda could never access the primary capital, but his heart condition took him before the lawyers finalized it. Brenda found this letter shortly after his death. Instead of honoring his final wishes, she locked it in the safe, buried the truth, and spent the next 5 years using the company as her personal weapon of control. Finding that letter was the ultimate closure Julian needed. It completely validated every single boundary we had set. He carefully folded the letter, placed it securely in his breast pocket, and walked out of that empty office without ever looking back. The ghost of his father's expectations had finally been laid to rest. With emotional ties severed, we moved forward with the final phase of liquidation. The $2 million estate where Brenda ruled her fake empire was officially listed. Because we stripped it of emotional value and treated it strictly as a distressed asset, it sold within 3 weeks to a real estate developer. The massive influx of capital from the house, combined with funds from the warehouse and truck fleet, was entirely secured in the irrevocable trust under Julian's name. But Julian and I had no interest in hoarding the money to buy expensive cars or flash designer labels. We knew the true value of generational wealth was not about projecting a fake image. It was about creating lasting positive impact. We took a significant portion of the liquidated funds and established a permanent educational endowment at the high school where Julian served as principal. We named the scholarship directly after his father, ensuring the man who actually built the wealth would be permanently honored. Every year, a full academic scholarship would be awarded to a graduating senior who demonstrated exceptional work ethic and a desire to study business administration. We took the money Brenda and Chloe tried to use for VIP nightclub tables and luxury handbags, and we turned it into a foundation that would actively change young lives for decades to come. The chaotic chapter of our lives involving Brenda and Chloe was permanently closed. We heard through the grapevine that Chloe had eventually taken a plea deal to avoid federal prison, resulting in 5 years of strict probation and mandatory restitution payments she would never realistically be able to afford. She was working a minimum wage retail job, her influencer dreams completely shattered. Brenda remained isolated in her tiny, noisy apartment, completely cut off from the church community she had once dominated, spending her days bitterly complaining to anyone who would listen about how her ungrateful son had stolen her life. But their misery was no longer our problem. We had completely detached our wagon from their sinking ship. Family is often presented as an unbreakable bond, a sacred obligation that requires you to endure endless disrespect simply because you share the same bloodline. But that is a toxic, dangerous lie. Loyalty should never require you to sacrifice your own financial security, your mental health, or your self-respect. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from the people who are actively trying to destroy you. Julian and I did not just win a financial dispute, we performed a necessary surgical extraction. We completely removed a generational curse of financial abuse, narcissistic manipulation, and toxic entitlement before it could ever infect our own future. Today, my life is exactly what I built it to be. I am still the executive director at Oak Capital, managing high-stakes portfolios with the same ruthless efficiency. Julian is still the respected principal of his high school, guiding the next generation with integrity and purpose. We did not use the trust fund money to upgrade our lifestyle to match the fake elites. Instead, we used it to completely pay off the mortgage on our own beautiful quiet home. As I peacefully sit right here on my back porch this beautiful evening, holding a warm cup of fresh coffee and watching the golden sun slowly set over the tall pine trees, I feel a profound, unshakable sense of calm. Julian steps out through the sliding glass door, resting his hand gently on my shoulder, before sitting in the chair next to mine. There are no debt collectors calling our phones. There are no manipulative family members demanding our money. There are no fake images to uphold. There is only the absolute, unbreakable peace that comes from establishing ironclad boundaries, protecting your own peace, and fiercely choosing your own worth.